Russian Schoolroom is a 1967 painting by Norman Rockwell. It's not Rockwell's most famous painting, and it's not his most valuable either, but it has possibly the strangest backstory of any painting of all time, with connections to everything from million-dollar art robberies to Steven Spielberg to the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. In the early 1970s, a St. Louis art gallery named Arts International was rocked by multiple robberies and lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in artwork. Over the years, much of the stolen artwork was found, but one painting remained missing: Norman Rockwell's Russian Schoolroom. The painting was valued at $25,000 when it was stolen in 1973, but Rockwell's paintings exploded in value during the 1980s and 90s, which meant the painting's value was potentially in the millions of dollars. But the painting was missing. Its location was a mystery for nearly 40 years, until in 2007, the missing painting was finally found in a pretty unlikely location: the personal art collection of Steven Spielberg. Yes, the movie director. The official story was that an art assistant for Spielberg noticed Russian Schoolroom on an FBI list of stolen artwork and realized Spielberg had purchased it in 1989. For nearly 20 years, this stolen painting had been sitting in Spielberg's art collection. The painting was now worth major money, and almost immediately a nasty court battle erupted over who was the true owner of this million-dollar painting. Art dealer Jack Solomon owned Russian Schoolroom when it was stolen in 1973. He'd been compensated $20,000 in insurance money after the painting was taken from the St. Louis Art Gallery, but he claimed he was still the rightful owner of Russian Schoolroom, and he sued Spielberg for the return of the painting. Solomon also sued the FBI because he claimed the FBI allowed Spielberg to keep possession of the painting even though they knew it was stolen. At the same time, an art dealer named Judy Goffman Cutler was also suing Solomon for a whopping $25 million. Cutler had sold Russian Schoolroom to Spielberg in the late 1980s and was suing Solomon because she claimed he'd made comments that implied she knew the painting was stolen when she sold it. In other words, he implied that she was trafficking in stolen artwork, and Cutler claimed these comments had damaged her reputation in the art world. As these court cases were waged, the painting was locked in a climate-controlled vault in Las Vegas, and it was unknown who would get it. But then the case took a very strange twist, because during all of these court battles, information about the 1973 art robbery that had started all of this resurfaced. The man who allegedly robbed the art gallery was named Russell Byers, and he had a really strange background, with links to the mob, the FBI, and strangest of all, the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1978, a man named John Crenshaw was arrested in Illinois after robbing a jewelry store. Crenshaw confessed that he'd helped steal Russian Schoolroom and other artwork from Arts International in St. Louis, and he claimed the heist was led by a man named Russell Byers. Police raided Byers' home based on the tip. They didn't find the Russian Schoolroom painting, but they did find over $300,000 worth of stolen artwork in his home. Despite this, the robbery charges against Byers were dropped, which seemed pretty baffling. This was a massive amount of stolen artwork, and it was pretty much a slam dunk case. And this is where the story gets weird, because Byers had some interesting links to the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. And some believe he wasn't prosecuted for the stolen artwork because he had connections to some very powerful people in Washington, D.C. Now, the official story of the MLK murder is that James Earl Ray was a lone assassin who performed the killing all on his own. There was no one else involved. But there are tons of people, including Martin Luther King Jr.'s family, who don't believe James Earl Ray was responsible for the killing. Back in the 1960s and 70s, there was a huge movement to reinvestigate King's murder, and in 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was formed to look into the many questions about the murder of Dr. King and other assassinations from that era. And one of the star witnesses during the hearings was our good friend Russell Byers, art thief extraordinaire. In his testimony, Byers claimed he was offered $50,000 to kill Martin Luther King Jr. by two wealthy St. Louis businessmen, a stockbroker named John Kaufman and a patent attorney named John Sutherland. The businessmen claimed they were part of a group of very rich people who wanted King dead. This information was a total bombshell during the House Select hearings. Not only was Byers offered money to kill Martin Luther King Jr., but he was naming the people who approached him. Byers turned down the offer, but things got stranger when it was learned that he had some interesting links to James Earl Ray. Byers' brother-in-law John Spica was serving a life sentence for murder in the same penitentiary as Ray at the time. Spica and Ray shared the same cell block and worked in the hospital together, and they were even described as friends. It was speculated that Byers told his brother-in-law about the $50,000 bounty to kill King, and his brother-in-law then told his friend James Earl Ray about it. And James Earl Ray accepted the bounty to kill King, the offer that Byers had turned down. During the House Select hearings, Byers' testimony about the $50,000 bounty on King and his links to James Earl Ray were the key information used to link Ray to King's murder. But the most interesting part about it is that there are some people who think the whole thing was one big lie. John Spica claimed he knew nothing about the bounty, never said anything to James Earl Ray about it, and called his brother-in-law Byers a liar. When James Earl Ray's financial records were examined, it was learned he was dead broke. He'd never been paid this $50,000 bounty that was supposedly his motivation for killing King. And during the hearings, the explanation for his lack of money was a strange one. It was claimed he'd killed King for the $50,000 bounty, but then never gotten around to actually collecting the bounty. Mark Lane, who was James Earl Ray's lawyer during the House Select hearings, insisted that the FBI was responsible for MLK's killing. It's very well known that the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover basically hated Martin Luther King. They constantly harassed him and spied on him when he was alive, and there have always been many rumors that the FBI was behind King's killing. And this is what Lane argued during the hearings, that the FBI was responsible for Martin Luther King's murder. He said Russell Byers and his whole story about the St. Louis $50,000 bounty was a hoax, and it was being used to try to frame James Earl Ray as the killer. Some believe Byers cut a deal with the FBI. In exchange for not being prosecuted for the art thefts, Byers was fed this $50,000 MLK bounty story and forced to tell it during the House Select hearings to divert attention away from the FBI's involvement in the assassination. The timing of it all could support Lane's theory. Byers was arrested with the $300,000 worth of stolen artwork in his home in March of 1978. Despite the slam dunk case, he wasn't prosecuted, and only a few months later he became the star witness in the House Select investigation into Martin Luther King's death. By the time Byers testified in 1978 in Washington, D.C., both businessmen who supposedly made him the offer were dead. John Spica died shortly afterward, too. He was serving a life sentence for murder but was strangely paroled in 1973, then had his legs blown off and died when dynamite was planted under his car in 1979. This winding, complex road ultimately leads back to the Russian Schoolroom painting. The painting remained missing throughout the 1970s and 80s. Its value skyrocketed into the high six figures, but it was described as impossible to sell since the FBI was constantly monitoring art sales for the stolen painting. Despite this, the painting appeared at an art auction in the late 1980s, and Cutler bought it, then sold it to Steven Spielberg. In 2007, Spielberg's art team saw an article mentioning the stolen painting and realized they'd owned a Russian Schoolroom for nearly 20 years. They reported the stolen painting, which led to the court battles over its ownership. Cutler ultimately gave Spielberg another Rockwell painting in exchange for Russian Schoolroom, and today the painting is on display at Cutler's Museum in Rhode Island, along with thousands of other pieces of famous artwork. But none of them have a bizarre, complicated backstory like Russian Schoolroom.